Rain came down hard over Vancouver that November, the kind that didn't fall so much as press, heavy and relentless against every surface it touched. Joel Mercer stood in the parking lot of the Fairmont Pacific Rim with his hands in the pockets of a jacket that had seen too many winters and his boots soaked through at the seams. He drove for a courier service that paid him by the kilometer. Tonight he'd done 11 hours and had $43 left after gas. He was heading back to the van when he saw the envelope. It was sitting on the wet asphalt beside the rear wheel of a black SUV that was idling near the loading bay, hazard lights blinking orange in the rain. A thick manila envelope, unsealed, the flap folded back. He picked it up without thinking, the way you pick up anything that looks like it shouldn't be on the ground. He pulled back the flap with one finger. Cash. Bundled. 50s and 100s, the band's still on. He didn't count it there. He carried it to the van, set it on the passenger seat, and counted it under the dome light with the rain hammering the roof. $80,000. He sat with both hands in his lap for a long time. The dome light ticked off automatically. He didn't move to turn it back on. His son's name was Ben, 8 years old, type 1 diabetes, diagnosed 16 months ago in a clinic in Burnaby on a Tuesday afternoon that had divided Joel's life cleanly into before and after. The insulin alone ran to $1,100 a month. The continuous glucose monitor, which Ben needed to sleep safely through the night without Joel waking every 2 hours to check him, was another $600. Provincial coverage picked up part of it. Not enough. Joel had sold his truck and bought the van for the courier work. He'd moved them from their 2-bedroom in Kitsilano to a 1-bedroom in East Van. He was 8 weeks behind on the storage unit where Ben's mother's things still were, and he hadn't told Ben that either. Clara had been gone for 2 years. An aneurysm. She had been 34 years old and had laughed at something on the radio 40 minutes before she died, and Joel had never been able to listen to that station again. He thought about all of this in the dark van in the parking lot. He thought about the glucose monitor alarm that went off at 2 a.m. and the nights Ben slept through it and Joel didn't. He thought about the letter from the storage facility dated 3 weeks ago. He thought about Ben's winter coat, which was a size too small and had a broken zipper that Joel had been meaning to fix for a month. Then he thought about who he was. He had told Ben in the hospital the week of the diagnosis, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed with the boy's hand in both of his, that the world was full of hard things and that the way a person moved through hard things was what they were made of. He had told him again in the parking lot of the pharmacy when the first prescription came back at $412, and Joel had paid it without blinking even though his hands were shaking. He had told him last winter on a Sunday when Ben had cried because he couldn't go skating with his class, and Joel had sat down on the kitchen floor next to him and said, "We don't quit, buddy. We figure it out." He could not look at his son in the morning as a different man than the one who had said those things. He picked up the envelope. He got out of the van. He walked back into the Fairmont through the service entrance, past the kitchen noise and the warm smell of the banquet hall, out into the lobby with its polished floors and the low hum of quiet money, and he set the envelope on the front desk. "Found this in the rear lot," he said. "Whoever lost it is probably looking for it by now. There's $80,000 in there." The clerk stared at him. Joel was already turning. "Your name, sir?" "It doesn't matter. Just lock it up." He walked back out into the rain. On the 3rd floor, behind a wall of glass that overlooked the main entrance, a woman named Claire Ashworth stood with a glass of sparkling water in one hand and her phone in the other and watched the man in the wet jacket walk out of the lobby without looking back. She had been watching from the moment the concierge called up to tell her a man had brought in the envelope from the board chair's car. She had watched him pick it up. She had watched him stand beside his van for what her assistant would later confirm was 4 minutes and 20 seconds. She had watched him carry it back inside. She set her glass down very carefully on the table behind her. "Find out who he is?" she said to the man standing 2 feet to her left. "Tonight." His name was Thomas, and he was very good at finding things out. The apartment on Nanaimo Street had a hallway light that buzzed when it was cold, which in Vancouver meant October through April. It buzzed most of the time. Joel had stopped mentioning it to the building manager in September. There were other things not to mention. The hot water pressure, the window in the kitchen that let the draft in along the left side if the wind came off the inlet at the right angle. He sat at the kitchen table that night, After Ben was asleep and looked at the bills the way he always looked at them, steadily, without flinching, as though looking away would make them worse. Medical. Storage. Utilities. The medical stack had a letter from the pharmacy benefit manager on top, printed on cream paper, explaining in careful language that Ben's continuous glucose monitor was being reclassified under a coverage review and that reimbursement would be suspended pending a new application process that would take 90 days. 90 days. He folded the letter once and put it at the bottom of the pile. Ben came out at some point in socks and a sweatshirt 2 sizes too big, shuffling in the way he did when he was almost asleep and not quite. He climbed onto the chair across from Joel and put his chin on his arms on the table. "Dad. Go to sleep, bud. Are we moving again?" Joel looked at him. "No." Ben nodded, absorbing this with the seriousness of a child who had been through enough to take a statement like that, at both its face value and its shadow. He was quiet for a moment. "Why is there a letter from Dr. Ian's office?" "It's just paperwork." Ben picked it up from the pile before Joel could stop him. He turned it over. He could read most of the words. His eyes went down the page slowly, and then he put it back without comment, which was worse than any question he could have asked. "Being in a tough spot," Joel said, "is not the same as being stuck." Ben looked at him. "I know," he said. "You always say that." "I say it because it's true." Ben reached over and took a corner of Joel's sleeve between his fingers, the way he had done since he was 3, and held it for a moment. Then he let go and went back to bed. Joel sat at the table alone and listened to the rain. Claire Ashworth had not been surprised by another human being in 11 years. She had built that particular immunity the expensive way. Her first business partner had walked out of their shared office with a client list he had no legal right to and a story he had no right to tell, and she had spent 8 months in court and another year rebuilding. The man she had trusted with the East Division of Ashworth Capital had been quietly moving money for 3 years before the auditors caught it, and she had only not gone to prison herself because she had documentation and a very good lawyer, and the particular luck of someone who is meticulous about keeping records even when they believe they don't need to. She had not trusted quickly since. She had not trusted much at all. She ran the company alone now. Ashworth Capital managed $700 million in assets across real estate, private equity, and a holdings group that included, among other things, a benefits administration company called Meridia Health Partners, which processed insurance claims on behalf of a dozen regional employers. She had not looked closely at Meridia in 2 years. It was profitable. It ran itself. She had not read the names on the quarterly denial reports because the quarterly denial reports were 11 pages long and the decisions inside them were made by people she paid to make them. Her assistant, a thorough and quiet man named Thomas, set a folder on her desk at 7 the next morning. "Joe Mercer," he said, 38, widowed. 1 son, 8, type 1 diabetic. He drives for a courier company in the lower mainland. He's 2 months behind on a storage unit in Burnaby. He left the RCMP in 2021. She looked up from the folder. "Left?" Thomas had a very particular expression for information he didn't enjoy delivering. He was making it now. He was a constable in Surrey. He pulled a 15-year-old girl out of a burning vehicle on the Trans-Canada in the summer of 2021. The vehicle exploded. He lost partial hearing in his left ear and had nerve damage in his right hand that made it hard to qualify for active service. He applied for a medical accommodation 3 times. Each time it was denied. The room was very quiet. She looked down at the folder. Her company held the benefits administration contract for the RCMP Pension Division Supplemental Plan. She had known that in the way she knew most things about Meridia, accurately and at a distance. "Pull the file on the accommodation denials," she said. "All of it." Thomas hesitated at the door. "There's one more thing." She waited. His son's glucose monitor coverage was suspended last month. The suspension came through Meridia. It was flagged as a reclassification of durable medical equipment under a policy update. He hasn't filed a new application yet. The 90-day window started 3 weeks ago. She looked at him for a long time without speaking. "Put it on my desk right tonight." The folder came up at 6 in the evening. She did not open it immediately. She answered the London call. She signed the charitable disbursement approvals for the quarter. She stood at the window for 20 minutes, watching the Burrard Inlet go dark under the last light, and thought about a man who had stood in a parking lot in the rain for 4 minutes with $80,000 and then walked it back inside a building where no one would have known the difference. She had spent 11 years building a company on the premise that people made decisions according to their own advantage, that the appearance of generosity was always a calculation, that trust was a liability that needed to be managed rather than extended. She opened the folder. The file on the accommodation denials was thinner than it should have been. 3 applications, 3 rejections, each one citing a different subsection of the supplemental coverage policy. The first cited insufficient documentation. The second cited a procedural error in the application that was, as far as she could read it, not an error at all, but a formatting difference between the form version the RCMP had provided and the version Meridia had updated without notification. The third had been denied by a claims assessor whose notes in the margin said, "Escalation risk suggests close." She read the notes twice. She moved to the Meridia file next. The quarterly denial report for the Pension Supplement Division. 48 claims reviewed, 41 denied. The denial rate had been climbing for 2 fiscal years. Somewhere inside the 41 was a number that corresponded to a constable in Surrey whose hearing was damaged and whose right hand shook, and who had pulled a 15-year-old girl out of a burning car and asked to keep serving and been told no 3 times in language designed to sound final and technical and not like what it was. She found it on page 8. Claim 2021 S317. Joel Mercer. Denied. Subsection 14 C. Active duty threshold not met post-injury. She had not signed this page herself. She had signed the quarterly approval summary on page 11, which confirmed the division's denial rate targets had been met. She had not read the names. She did not cry. She hadn't cried in a long time and she wasn't going to begin over a claims file. But she sat in the dim office with her hand resting on the open page, and she understood, in the way that truly clear things arrive, that her company's administrative efficiency had a specific address on Nanaimo Street and a specific boy asleep in a specific bed whose glucose monitor was suspended because the form version had been wrong and no one at Meridia had been required to care about the difference. She closed the file. She picked up her phone. "Thomas," she said, "I need a rental property. Something in East Van or Burnaby. Needs work, manageable. Get it through the secondary holdings, not my name. Have it registered under a numbered company. Make it look like a private landlord situation." She paused. "And find me a handyman referral service that a regular person would actually use. A flyer or a community board listing, something that looks like you found it on a telephone pole." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Tonight?" he said. "By tomorrow morning?" The house was on Semlin Drive, a narrow lot with a small front porch and a side fence that had been hit by something large at some point and never been fully repaired. The kitchen window faced east and caught the morning light at an angle that made it look better than it was. She had the key by Thursday and spent Friday afternoon in the empty rooms making a list of things that needed doing and practicing the particular version of herself she was going to need to be. She called from the kitchen on Saturday morning. He answered on the second ring. "Mercer Repairs." His voice was even and a little lower than she'd expected from someone 38. There was, somewhere behind it, a small sound. A cereal bowl. A spoon. "My name is Claire Reed," she said. She had decided on a different last name so the first wouldn't register immediately if he searched it. "I just took over a rental property on Semlin Drive. The previous owner left it in rougher shape than the listing suggested. I was given your name through a community listing." He was quiet for a moment. She heard the small sounds settle. "What kind of work?" "General repairs. The fence on the east side, some interior drywall. The side door doesn't close properly. There's a window upstairs that I think has a failed seal." "I can come Monday," he said. "I charge $40 an hour and I'll give you a written estimate before I start anything significant." "Monday is fine." She gave him the address. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen of the empty house and looked at her own reflection in the dark window above the sink and thought that she had done many difficult things in her professional life and that none of them had felt quite like this. He arrived at 8:57. She had been there since 7:30 and she had been watching the street from the upstairs window for most of it. In the daylight and outside a hotel lobby, he looked different than she'd expected. Steadier. He walked the way people walk when they have learned to be deliberate about movement, because careless movement has cost them something. He had a toolbox in one hand and a notepad in the other, and he was looking at the fence before he'd finished coming through the gate. "That'll need new posts on the east side," he said when she opened the door. "Not just the boards. Whoever hit it shifted the footings." She stepped back to let him in. He moved through the front hall, looking up at the corners, pressing a hand against the wall near the staircase to test for movement, crouching to look at the baseboards in the living room. He was already working. He gave her the estimate after 90 minutes. It was less than she had expected, and she told him so. "It's what the work costs," he said, in a tone that did not leave room for negotiation. They came back Tuesday, Thursday, the following Monday. He did not ask about her personal life. He did not look at her watch or her car or the quality of the appliances she'd had installed in the kitchen. He looked at the walls and the wiring and the gap at the bottom of the side door. He brought his own coffee and drank it on the porch and didn't offer commentary on anything that wasn't related to the job. She left her phone on the kitchen counter one afternoon while she took a call in the front room. When she came back, it was where she had left it. He was measuring the door frame with a tape he held at one end, the other end hooked on the jamb. She left her laptop open the following Thursday, deliberately, with a document pulled up that had nothing important in it. It was closed when she came back. He had moved it slightly to give himself room to work on the floor beside it. On his fourth visit, she left her handbag on the kitchen table, unzipped. She could see inside it from the hallway. She watched him work around the table without looking at it for an hour and a half. When she came into the kitchen to make coffee, he was kneeling in front of the baseboard heater near the window and did not acknowledge the bag at all. She poured 2 cups without asking and set one on the counter near him. He stood, looked at it, said thanks, and picked it up. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen for a moment without speaking. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post he hadn't fixed yet and looked into the window with the solemn judgment of crows. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. He looked at the coffee. "Couple of years, since I left the RCMP." She had prepared for this question. What happened there? He was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone deciding whether to lie, but in the way of someone choosing how much truth fit the conversation. "Didn't work out the way I'd planned," he said. He sounded like a man who had made peace with that sentence. She did not ask more. He didn't offer more. The crow left the fence post. The moment passed. Ben came the second week of December, on a Wednesday when the sitter had canceled, and Joel had called ahead the way she could hear the apology forming before the words arrived. "They'll stay in the van with his book," Joel said. "He won't be in your way." "Bring him in," Claire said before she had finished deciding. "It's too cold to sit in a van." He came up the porch steps with his father's hand in his left and the library book in his right, wearing a toque that had a small patch on the cuff where it had been mended with different colored yarn. He was to Claire from the bottom of the steps with the direct evaluation of a child who has had to assess adults quickly and has gotten good at it. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. "What are you reading?" He held it up. It was a book about a dog that gets lost during a flood and has to find its way back to its family across 3 provinces. "Does he make it?" she said. Ben looked at her. "It's about whether you give up or you don't," he said. "The dog doesn't give up." She crouched so she was level with him. "That sounds like a good book." "It is," Ben said. "My dad reads it with me at night. He does the voices." Joel made a small sound behind him that Ben ignored. She set Ben up at the kitchen table with his book and a plate of crackers and a glass of apple juice that she had bought that morning at the grocery store without fully admitting to herself why. He read with the focused quiet of a child who had learned that certain hours were his to own, and occasionally he ate a cracker, and every so often he looked up to check where his father was. At noon, she brought a sandwich to the kitchen and set it next to the crackers. Ben looked at it. "Thank you," he said in the careful way of a child who has been taught manners from the inside out rather than the surface. "You're welcome." He picked up the sandwich. He looked at her with a directness that reminded her oddly of his father. "You're not like a regular landlord," he said. "No. Regular landlords don't have apple juice." She smiled. Ben took a bite of the sandwich and looked down at his book. He read for a minute. Then, without looking up, he said, "My mom would have liked it here. She liked old houses." Claire did not answer right away. She looked at the window, at the gray December light coming through the east-facing glass. "It's a good house," she said finally. "Yeah," Ben said. He turned a page. "I think so too." At the end of the afternoon, when Joel was packing his toolbox near the door, Ben tore a sheet from the small sketchbook he'd had open on the table for the last hour and folded it once without ceremony and held it out to Claire. She unfolded it. It was a drawing of the kitchen, seen from where he'd been sitting. The window, the counter, the table, and at the table, facing toward the window, a woman with her chin in her hand, looking out at something Ben had drawn as light coming through glass in long diagonal lines. He had written in the bottom corner, in careful capitals, "The Lady, W.H.U. Buck the Old House." She folded it once and put it in her coat pocket. She did not take it out again for a long time. The first sign of trouble came 9 days later. A property manager in Burnaby, named Kevin Strand, who had used Joel for 3 jobs in the past year, called to say he was going a different direction and wished him all the best. He sounded like a man who had been told what to say and was trying to say it kindly. 2 days after that, a building supervisor in New Westminster stopped returning calls after 4 years of steady work. Joel did not mention it to Claire. She heard him on the back porch one afternoon, voice low, asking someone on the phone what exactly they were saying was the problem. She could hear, through the kitchen window, the particular quietness of a man being careful with his anger. "That wasn't how it happened," he said. "And then, I understand." And then, nothing for a while. He came back inside and went back to work as though the call had not happened. That evening, in a parking garage near the Ashworth Capitol building, Thomas sat in his car and spoke quietly to a man named Bryce Hollander, who was Meridia's head of claims operations and who had been quietly managing the story of Joel Mercer's accommodation denials for 3 years. Hollander had contacts in the contracting world. He knew how to make a phone call that sounded like a heads up and landed like a warning. He had been useful in this way before. "She's asking questions about the file," Thomas said. "Handle it before it becomes something." He didn't know that Ashworth had already read every page of it. The story moved through the trades in the way old damage moves, quietly and faster than anyone thinks. By mid-December, the version in circulation in the handyman and property management networks around Greater Vancouver said that Joel Mercer had been removed from the RCMP under circumstances that were vague enough to mean anything. No one said anything specific. They didn't have to. His landlord called and said the building was going under new management and he'd need to be out in 30 days. Joel did not tell Ben that night. He told him the next morning, carefully, in the kitchen, over cereal with the radio off. Ben listened. He ate his cereal. He said, "Are we going to your cousin's again?" Joel said they'd figure something else out. Ben picked up a spoon. "Okay," he said, and then, "We always do." The glucose monitor alarm went off at 2017 that night, and Joel was out of bed before it finished its first cycle. Down the hall, checking the reader, adjusting the dosage on the pen the way the endocrinologist had shown him at the clinic in October. Ben slept through it. He almost always slept through it. Joel sat on the edge of the narrow bed until the numbers stabilized and the boy's breathing was even and soft. And then he went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a long time in the dark, without turning the light on. In the Ashworth Capitol building on West Georgia Street, Claire sat at her desk with 2 things in front of her. The first was a draft statement from the Meridia communications team, prepared at the request of the board chair who had called her twice the previous afternoon, recommending that in light of a pending CBC inquiry into the division's denial practices, Ashworth Capitol should consider a proactive distancing from Meridia's operational decisions in a way that would protect the parent company's profile. The statement referred to the claims process as an autonomous function of the subsidiary. It was 6 paragraphs long, and it did not contain the word wrong anywhere. The second was Joel's accommodation file. All of it, the 3 denials, the margin notes, the coverage policy update that had changed the form version without notifying applicants, the quarterly report with the denial rate targets, her own signature on the summary approval on page 11. She read both documents in order. She thought about a man standing in the rain beside a van with $80,000 that did not belong to him, and then walking it back inside. She thought about a boy who had said it's about whether you give up or you don't, and had meant it the way you only mean something if you've had to decide it. She thought about the drawing in her coat pocket with "The Lady, WHU, Bouth House," written in capitals at the bottom. She put the Meridia statement face down on the desk. She picked up her phone. "Set a press conference," she said. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, the lobby. Every outlet, no pre-screening." Her communications director said, "What's the subject matter?" "The Meridia claims practices," she said, "and a specific file I want to read publicly into the record." There was a silence. "Ma'am, the board will." "I know what the board will do. Make the call." She did not sleep. She stood at the window and watched the lights on the inlet for a long time, and she thought that there was a particular clarity available to a person who had stopped trying to protect the wrong things. She had not felt it often. She recognized it now. The press conference happened at 9 sharp. She stood at a plain lectern in the lobby without notes, in a gray wool coat she had owned for 7 years, and she began without greeting. "In the summer of 2021, she said, a constable with the RCMP named Joel Mercer pulled a 15-year-old girl from a burning vehicle on the Trans-Canada Highway outside Hope, British Columbia. Moments before the vehicle exploded, he sustained hearing loss and nerve damage in his right hand. He filed 3 applications for medical accommodation so that he could continue to serve. All 3 were denied." The room was murmuring. It stopped. The denials were processed through Meridia Health Partners, a benefits administration subsidiary of Ashworth Capital. Each denial cited a different policy subsection. The 3rd application was flagged internally as an escalation risk and closed. "I have read each of these files. My signature appears on the quarterly approval summary that confirmed the division's denial rate targets for that period had been met. I did not read the individual claims. That is not a defense." She looked at the cameras without looking away. In the 2 years since his discharge, a false account of the circumstances of Constable Mercer's departure from the RCMP has circulated in the contracting networks where he works for his living. That account has been allowed to stand uncorrected by people within my organization who had reason to know it was false, and who allowed it to continue because it protected us from a conversation we should have been having since 2021. I am correcting it now. Joel Mercer saved a girl's life. He asked to keep serving. We told him no, and then we made it harder for him to be believed when he tried to build something else. She set both hands on the lectern. Ashworth Capital is establishing the Clara Mercer Foundation, named for Joel Mercer's late wife. The foundation will provide medical equipment coverage, housing assistance, and reintegration support for first responders injured in the line of duty across British Columbia and Alberta. I am committing $70 million of personal assets as the foundation's founding endowment. Meridia Health Partners will reopen and re-adjudicate every denied accommodation claim filed by first responders over the past 5 fiscal years. Corrected determinations will be issued with back payment from original denial dates. She drew a breath. The lobby was entirely still. Effective at the conclusion of this statement, I am resigning as Chief Executive Officer of Ashworth Capital. I will not be retaining a board seat or advisory role. My name is on the approval page. That page was wrong. That page is mine." She did not take questions. She walked through the lobby and out the front doors and into the car that was waiting at the curb, and she did not look back at the cameras. Joel watched the press conference on his phone in the kitchen, with the cereal bowls still on the table and Ben in the other room getting his shoes on for school. He had the volume low and he held it close to his face to read the captions as they scrolled, and he understood somewhere around the 2nd paragraph that she was not speaking to the press. She said Clara's name. She said it in the same sentence as his. He sat still for a long time after the broadcast ended. Ben came to the kitchen doorway with his backpack on one shoulder and saw his father's face. "Dad? Give me a minute, bud." Ben came and stood next to the chair and didn't say anything, which was something Joel had noticed about his son. The boy always knew when words would be less than the moment needed. He put his hand on his father's shoulder and left it there. Joel covered it with his own. They stayed like that for a moment. Then Joel said okay, and stood up and got Ben's coat from the hook and zipped it up to the chin. "Let's go." The night Ben came off the intensive monitoring protocol that Meridia had reinstated in full, he asked if they could have pancakes for dinner, and Joel said yes. They made them together in the kitchen. Ben standing on the step stool at the counter with flour on his sleeve, Joel beside him reading the back of the box and pretending he needed to. The radio was on. A station Clara had never listened to, which made it safe. Ben poured the batter in circles that were not quite circles. "Dad," he said. "Yeah." "Is Miss Reed going to come by again?" Joel looked at the pan. "Probably not. The work on the house is done." Ben nodded. He poured another not quite circle. "She knows stuff," he said. "Like what?" "Like what it's like when things are hard and you keep going anyway. You can tell." Joel turned the burner down slightly. He looked at his son. "What makes you think that?" Ben shrugged. "She has the same look you do," he said, "like she decided something." Joel was quiet for a moment. He put the spatula down on the rest beside the stove. "Maybe," he said. 7 months later, Joel opened a small shop on a corner in Port Moody in a storefront that had been a photo lab for 30 years, and then a short-lived tea shop, and then nothing. He kept the original tile floor and the long counter along the front window. He painted the door a deep blue-green that Ben had chosen from the hardware store samples by holding each one up to the morning light and picking the one that looked most like it meant something. Over the entrance he hung a simple wooden sign that said Mercer and Son Replars Restorations. The ampersand had been Ben's idea. Joel had asked if he was sure he wanted his name on it. Ben had looked at him with the expression he used when he thought a question was too easy. "Of course I do," he said. The shop did not make them wealthy. It made them enough. A coffee maker ran in the back room almost constantly. Old televisions and clocks and lamps came in through the front door. A man who had lived on the block for 40 years brought in a shortwave radio that his father had owned before him, and Joel spent 3 Saturdays on it, and when he was done, the man sat at the counter and they listened to it together. Ben did his homework at a table near the back window, with his medical bag on the chair beside him and his sketchbook open beside the textbook. He drew the customers. He drew the street outside. He drew his father's hands working on a circuit board under the lamp. In late June, Claire came in. She had not known she was going to. She had been in Port Moody visiting a site for the Foundation's first community grant, and she had found herself on the main street, and then she had found herself standing outside the blue-green door reading the sign. She stood there long enough that Ben spotted her from the window and came to the door. "Miss Reed." "Hi," she said. He was taller. Kids were always taller when you expected them to stay the same. "Dad," Ben called back into the shop, without looking around. Joel came from the back. He saw her through the window before he reached the door. He stopped in the middle of the shop for a moment. Then he walked to the door and opened it. They stood in the doorway looking at each other in the June light. "You changed the sign," she said. He looked up at it. Ben's idea. "It's good." He looked back at her. He was doing the same thing she was doing, she realized. Taking inventory, deciding what was still true. "How's the foundation?" she said. "Growing," she said. "Slowly, that's how it should go." He nodded. He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "The coffee's on." Ben had already gone back to his table and his sketchbook. He was drawing something in the careful, focused way he had, his head bent, the pencil moving in small, certain lines. He didn't look up when she came in. He was concentrating. She sat at the counter. Joel brought 2 cups and set one in front of her and leaned against the counter across from it with his own. They talked for a while. About the Foundation's first grant. About a clock Joel was trying to source a specific part for. About a book Ben was reading. Easy things, the kind of talk that happens between people who are finding the shape of something that is not quite like anything they've had before and are in no hurry to name it wrong. At some point, Ben finished whatever he was drawing and tore the page from the sketchbook and folded it once and put it face down on the counter between them without a word. Joel looked at his son. Ben looked back with the expression of someone who had absolutely nothing to apologize for. Joel picked up the page. He unfolded it. It was a drawing of the shop, seen from above, the way you'd see it if you were a bird or a thought or someone who loved the place enough to want the whole picture. The counter, the front window, the blue-green door standing open. 2 figures at the counter with cups in front of them. Smaller, at the back table, a boy with a sketchbook. And at the bottom, in Ben's careful capitals, 2 words. "Good people." I keep coming back to that parking lot. The rain. The dome light ticking off, a man sitting in the dark with $80,000 on the seat beside him and $43 in his wallet, and a son at home whose medication costs more than most people's rent. Nobody watching, nobody who would ever know, and he walked it back inside anyway. That's the part that stays with me, not the press conference, not the foundation, the parking lot. Because everything that came after, all of it, started there, in that moment when Joel decided who he was going to be when it cost him something real. I think we misunderstand integrity sometimes. We treat it like a personality trait, something you either have or you don't. But watching what happened to Joel, I don't think it works that way. I think it's a practice. It's the accumulation of small decisions made when no one's grading you. Joel had been making those decisions for years, in hospitals and pharmacy lineups, on a kitchen floor with his son crying about skating. He hadn't been building a reputation. He'd been building a self, and when the moment came that mattered most, he already knew what to do, because he'd already done it 1,000 times in smaller ways. Claire's part of this is harder for me to sit with, honestly, because she wasn't a villain. She was just someone who had learned, through real pain, to manage distance instead of risk trust. She built a company. She protected herself. She signed the quarterly summaries and didn't read the names, and none of that felt wrong at the time because the system was functioning and the numbers were right, and she was busy. I've done versions of that, I think most of us have. We approve things we don't fully understand because we trust the structure, and sometimes the structure is quietly crushing someone we've never met. What changed her wasn't a speech or an argument. It was watching a man make a choice she had stopped believing people made. That's the thing about genuine decency. It doesn't persuade through logic. It persuades through evidence. Joel was evidence, and once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it, and she couldn't keep running a company that contradicted what she now knew was possible. Ben is the one I think about most, though. 8 years old, counting his father's courage like it was oxygen. Carrying it, reciting it back on hard days the way you recite something you need to stay true. Being in a tough spot is not the same as being stuck. He believed that because his father had proved it, over and over, in the unspectacular daily way that nobody writes about. The 2 a.m. alarm checks, the folded letters at the bottom of the pile, the steady voice in the kitchen when the news was bad. That's what I take from this. Not that good things happen to good people in some neat karmic accounting. Life is far too complicated and far too unfair for that kind of comfort. But that who you are, practiced quietly and consistently when it's inconvenient, has a way of becoming visible. Not always, not on a schedule, but often enough. Joel wasn't honest because he thought someone was watching from the 3rd floor. He was honest because his son was watching from across a kitchen table every morning, and he had decided long before that night what that boy was going to see. The sign above the shop door says Mercer & Son. Ben picked the ampersand. Of course he did.